Claire Dawson woke up to the sound of a loose fence panel knocking against the post outside her kitchen window. It had been doing that for days, but this morning it felt louder, more urgent, like a reminder that she had been putting things off for too long. She stepped out into her backyard, coffee in hand, and looked at the old wooden fence that separated her house from her new neighbors. The boards were crooked, the paint was peeling, and the whole thing leaned like it was tired of standing. Spring had just begun in Maplewood, Oregon. The air smelled of wet grass and pine, and small flowers were starting to bloom along the fence line. Claire loved her garden. It was her safe place, the only thing that had stayed constant since her divorce 2 years ago. But today she could barely focus on the flowers. All she saw was the fence, half falling apart and mocking her quiet independence. She sighed and set her mug on the table. "Guess it's time," she muttered, grabbing her gloves and toolbox. She wasn't the type to ask for help. For years, she'd learned to do things alone, fix leaks, change bulbs, mow the lawn. It wasn't pride, just survival. But this fence was too big for one person. And she knew it. As she started pulling off the loose boards, she heard a voice behind her. "That fence doesn't stand a chance, does it?" Startled, she turned around. Standing near the hedge was her neighbor, Ethan Walker, wearing a flannel shirt, work gloves, and a friendly smile. He looked to be in his early 40s, tall, calm, and the kind of man who seemed comfortable doing hard work. He had moved in just a few weeks ago, and though they'd exchanged polite hellos, then really talked. Claire laughed lightly. "Yeah, I think it's finally giving up." Ethan stepped closer, eyeing the broken section. "You fixing it alone?" She hesitated. "I was going to try." He nodded slowly, then said, "I've got tools in my shed. If you want a hand, I don't mind helping." Claire wanted to say no. She didn't like accepting help, especially from someone she barely knew. But she looked at the boards, then at him, and realized there was no harm in letting someone be kind. "That would be nice," she said finally. Ethan smiled and disappeared briefly, returning with a toolbox and a measuring tape. "All right, let's get this thing standing again." They began working together almost in silence at first, but it wasn't awkward. Claire held the boards steady while Ethan hammered them in with practiced ease. He was quick, focused, and easygoing. Every now and then he made a light comment that made her smile, small things about the weather, or how Cooper, his golden retriever, had tried to chase a squirrel up a tree that morning. It surprised Claire how easily she found herself relaxing. For months, she had been in her own little world, wake up, work, cook dinner alone, go to bed. But now, with Ethan beside her, the day didn't feel so quiet. She caught herself glancing at him more than once, noticing how the sunlight caught in his hair or how his eyes softened when he laughed. By noon, they had repaired half the fence. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled at her. "You've got a good eye for measurements," he said. Claire laughed. "I've had practice. My ex-husband never liked doing this kind of thing, so I learned." Ethan paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "You're good at it." She smiled but didn't answer. It wasn't something she wanted to talk about. Her ex, the silence, the years of pretending everything was fine. Instead, she turned her focus back to the next board. But Ethan's words stayed with her. After a while, they took a break under the shade of her apple tree. Claire brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, and they sat in comfortable quiet. Cooper lay at their feet, tail wagging slowly. Ethan glanced around her yard. "You've got a nice place here," he said. "Feels peaceful." Used to feel empty, she admitted before she could stop herself. Then she quickly smiled. "But it's getting better." He nodded as if he understood more than she said. Sometimes peace takes time. The wind picked up gently, carrying the scent of apple blossoms. For a moment, neither spoke. There was something calm about Ethan, not the kind of calm that comes from being quiet, but the kind that comes from someone who has seen pain and learned to live through it. Claire felt a strange comfort sitting next to him. A man she barely knew, but somehow didn't feel like a stranger. As the day went on, they finished nearly the entire section. The fence stood straight now, strong and new. Claire stepped back, hands on her hips, proud. "It actually looks good," she said. Ethan smiled. It's solid. Should last a while. Before she could reply, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it, a message from her ex-husband Mark, saying he wanted to talk about unfinished things. Her face fell slightly. She didn't want those memories to come flooding back now. Not when the day had felt so light. Ethan noticed her change immediately. Everything okay? He asked, concern in his voice. Claire nodded quickly, forcing a small smile. It's nothing. Just life. He didn't press further. Well, he said softly, if life ever gets too heavy, I've got strong shoulders next door. That simple kindness caught her off guard. She laughed softly, not sure how to respond. Thanks, Ethan. He gathered his tools and gave her one last smile before heading back to his yard. We'll finish the rest tomorrow. He asked. Tomorrow sounds good, she said, watching him go. When the gate closed behind him, Claire stood quietly in the golden evening light. The fence was fixed halfway, but her heart felt strangely unsettled. She wasn't sure what exactly had shifted that day. Maybe it was just nice to have company again, to feel seen. Or maybe it was something more. She looked at the sturdy line of wood between their yards and smiled faintly. That morning, it had been just a broken fence. But now, somehow, it felt like the start of something new. Something she hadn't felt in years. As the sun dipped behind the trees, she whispered to herself, maybe this time. Something good is finally starting. Inside his yard, Ethan glanced back once more, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. Fixing that fence wasn't the only thing he wanted to build, and from that moment, neither of them realized how much one simple favor, one small act of help would change both of their lives forever. The next few days in Maplewood were bright and quiet. But neither Claire nor Ethan could stop thinking about that afternoon they'd spent fixing the fence together. Claire caught herself glancing toward his yard whenever she stepped outside. She told herself it was just to see how the fence was holding up. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about the fence anymore. Ethan, on the other hand, had been restless too. He had fixed hundreds of fences in his life, but none of them had stayed in his mind the way this one did, because this one came with Claire's laughter, her soft voice, and that look in her eyes that lingered longer than it should have. 3 mornings later, Claire was out in her backyard again, struggling to lift a heavy piece of lumber she'd bought to finish the last section of the fence. The sun was already warm, and the boards were heavier than she expected. As she tried to balance one against the post, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Need backup. She turned around, smiling despite herself. Ethan stood there in his usual flannel shirt, cup of coffee in one hand, and that calm, easy smile on his face. I thought you might have forgotten about our unfinished project, she teased. Forget? Not a chance. A promise is a promise. He handed her the coffee and grabbed the other end of the lumber. Besides, I can't just let you wrestle with this fence alone. Working together again felt natural, almost too natural. They didn't have to talk much. Their rhythm had already found itself. Claire would measure. Ethan would cut. She'd hold the boards. He'd nail them in. They worked like two people who had done this together for years, not days. But this time, they talked more. Claire asked him about his work. And he told her he built decks, cabinets, and small home repairs. It keeps me busy, he said. Then his tone softened. After my wife passed, I couldn't sit still. So I just built things. It helped quiet the noise in my head. Claire paused for a second. I'm sorry, Ethan, I didn't know. He gave a small nod. It's been 3 years now. She was sick for a long time. I guess part of me still tries to fix things I couldn't fix back then. Claire felt her chest tighten. There was so much quiet strength in his words. No bitterness, just acceptance. You must have loved her a lot, she said softly. I did, he said simply. Then after a pause, he added, but life doesn't stop asking you to live. So here I am, building fences again. His honesty struck something deep in her. She understood that feeling, losing something, rebuilding piece by piece. Trying to move forward without knowing where exactly forward is. She thought about her divorce. How she'd spent nights convincing herself she was fine, when in truth, she was just surviving. "I guess we're both fixing fences," she said with a small, bittersweet smile. Ethan looked up at her, meeting her eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly, "just different kinds." They stood like that for a few seconds, two people surrounded by quiet, sawdust and sunlight, feeling the kind of connection that doesn't need words. Claire looked away first, pretending to adjust a board, her heart beating faster than she liked. By afternoon, they were nearly finished. The fence looked beautiful, strong, smooth, and steady. Claire stepped back to admire it, and Ethan stood beside her, both smiling with the quiet pride of shared effort. "You're good at this," she said. "You make a good partner," he replied. Their eyes met again. And for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, something warm, uncertain, and real. Claire could feel it rising inside her, that small flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. But before she could say anything, Ethan reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. It was a gentle, unthinking gesture, but the touch lingered. And so did the silence that followed. Claire froze for a second. The world seemed to slow down. The wind, the birds, everything. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked at him. Searching for something in his eyes she wasn't sure she wanted to find, but then Cooper barked loudly from the other yard, breaking the spell. Claire stepped back quickly, flustered but smiling to cover it up. "I should probably check on the paint," she said. Her voice slightly unsteady. Ethan nodded, pretending to adjust his gloves. "Yeah, good idea." The air between them felt heavier now, not uncomfortable, but charged, like something had changed and neither knew what to do about it. When they wrapped up for the day, Claire walked him to the gate. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky gold and pink. Ethan turned to her before leaving. "You know," he said lightly, "this fence looks a lot better than I expected." Claire smiled. "Guess we make a good team." He hesitated for half a second before replying, "Yeah, we do." She watched him walk back to his yard, Cooper trotting behind him, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt a mix of peace and restlessness she couldn't explain. That night, she sat by her living room window, staring at the fence they'd built. It stood tall and perfect. But it felt more than just a line of wood. It felt like a story still unfolding. She thought about the way Ethan looked at her, how careful his words were, how gentle his hands were when he worked. She wasn't used to that kind of attention, quiet, respectful, and real. It scared her a little because she had promised herself she wouldn't get attached again. But her heart wasn't listening. Across the yard, Ethan sat on his porch, a cup of tea in his hand, looking toward the same fence. He could see the soft light coming from Claire's living room window and found himself smiling. He didn't know what this feeling was. Comfort, admiration, maybe even the beginning of something more, but he knew it felt right. He thought about how easily they'd talked, how natural it felt to work beside her, and how, for the first time in years, the silence after sunset didn't feel lonely. In her house. Claire finally stood up, closed the curtains, and whispered to herself, "Don't overthink this." But deep down, she already knew she would. Outside, the new fence stood firm, shining under the moonlight, strong but not perfect. Some boards were slightly uneven, small cracks still visible between them. But maybe that was the beauty of it. It was built by two people who knew what it meant to be broken and who, without realizing it, were slowly learning how to mend each other too. And as the night settled over Maplewood, both of them went to sleep thinking the same thing, that somehow this wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about two hearts quietly finding their way back to feeling again. The days after finishing the fence felt strange for both Claire and Ethan. The project that had brought them together was done, yet their thoughts still drifted toward each other. Claire tried to distract herself with work, rearranging her clients' living spaces, but even while sketching designs, she caught herself smiling at memories of their quiet talks and shared laughter. Ethan, meanwhile, found excuses to step outside, fixing his mailbox, checking the lawn, hoping he might catch a glimpse of her watering the flowers or sitting with her morning coffee, but the fence now stood tall between their yards. Perfect and solid, and in a way, it reflected the quiet wall that had grown between them. Neither wanted to admit it, but both missed the easy rhythm they'd found when building it together. One late afternoon, dark clouds began to roll in from the mountains. The air grew heavy, and the wind started to carry that sharp electric smell of rain. By evening, thunder echoed through Maplewood and a full storm swept over the neighborhood. Claire sat by her living room window, watching the rain hit the glass in waves. She didn't mind storms usually, but this one felt fierce. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a deep rumble that shook the house. Then came the sound, a loud crash from the backyard. Claire jumped up, heart pounding, and ran to the back door. When she looked outside, she saw what had happened. The old oak tree near her garden had fallen, snapping part of the newly built fence. The sight made her stomach twist. All that work gone in an instant. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her raincoat and ran outside into the downpour. The wind whipped at her face as she tried to pull away branches from the broken panels. The rain was freezing, soaking her within seconds. She was struggling to move a thick branch when she heard a shout. "Claire, Quay, what are you doing out here?" She turned and saw Ethan running toward her, already drenched, his flashlight cutting through the storm. The tree fell. She shouted back over the wind. "I can see that," he said, half laughing, half shouting. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Together, they started pulling the branches away. It was hard work. The wood was heavy and slick from the rain. Ethan pushed one branch aside while Claire steadied the broken boards. The storm raged around them, thunder shaking the ground, lightning flashing just above. Despite the chaos, they worked in sync, barely needing to speak. At one point, Claire lost her footing in the mud and slipped, but before she hit the ground, Ethan caught her by the arms. His grip was firm, steady. For a moment, time stopped. They stood inches apart, rain streaming down their faces, hearts beating fast. She looked up at him, breathless. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Yeah, I'm fine." He didn't let go right away. The moment hung between them, filled with something neither could name: comfort, fear, longing, maybe all at once. Then Ethan gently helped her stand upright. "Let's get this done before the wind takes the rest," he said. They worked for another 20 minutes until they had cleared enough of the fallen branches to stabilize the damaged section. The rain finally started to slow, turning into a light drizzle. Both were exhausted, muddy, and soaked to the bone. When the storm eased, Ethan turned to her. "You should get inside before you catch a cold." She nodded but didn't move. The adrenaline was fading, and she suddenly felt the weight of the night pressing down. The sight of the broken fence, the storm, the exhaustion, it all hit her at once. "I hate this," she whispered. "We worked so hard on it." Ethan stepped closer. "Hey," he said gently, "it's just wood. We can fix it." "It's not just the fence," she said, her voice trembling a little. "Everything always feels like it's falling apart right when I start to feel okay again." He looked at her quietly, understanding exactly what she meant. "Then maybe it's not falling apart," he said softly. "Maybe it's just showing you what still needs care." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled faintly. There was something about the way he said things, simple, steady, and true. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" Ethan gave a small shrug, his eyes kind. "Only when it comes to fences and people worth fixing." That made her laugh through the tears. For a moment, the world felt calm again. The storm had passed, but what lingered between them was stronger than before. A quiet understanding that went deeper than friendship as they walked toward the porch. Another flash of lightning lit up the yard, followed by a soft rumble. Ethan glanced at the sky. "We should wait here until it clears completely," he said. They stood together under the porch roof, rain dripping from the edge above them. Their clothes clung to their skin, and their breaths came out in soft white clouds from the cold. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full of something tender, something waiting. Claire wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Ethan noticed and wordlessly took off his flannel jacket, draping it over her shoulders. It was still wet, but warmer than the night air. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Always," he replied, his voice low, sincere. The word echoed in her mind, always, simple but heavy with meaning. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was something close. They stood there for a long while, just listening to the rain soften and fade. Neither said much, only sound was the distant roll of thunder and the soft patter of water dripping from the roof. It was one of those moments that didn't need words, a fragile, beautiful calm after the chaos. When the rain finally stopped completely, Ethan turned to her. "Tomorrow morning, I'll come over and we'll fix it, together." She smiled softly, her heart warm despite the chill. "You don't have to. I know," he said, "but I want to." As he stepped off the porch and into the wet grass, Claire watched him disappear into the dim light. Her chest felt full, not just with gratitude, but something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. When she finally went inside, she leaned against the door and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Outside, the broken fence stood half fallen under the moonlight, a symbol of imperfection, but also of connection. Because that night, under the storm, something had changed. The fence might have cracked, but their hearts had opened just a little wider. And neither of them would ever forget the night when the storm brought more than rain. It brought them closer, in ways they hadn't expected and couldn't explain. The morning after the storm was calm and bright, as if the world had been washed clean. Sunlight glowed softly through the wet leaves, and tiny drops of water sparkled on the grass. Claire stepped out onto her porch, wrapped in a warm sweater, holding her first cup of coffee. The air was cool, filled with that fresh scent that only comes after rain. Her eyes moved toward the fence. The broken section still leaned awkwardly where the old tree had fallen. But somehow it didn't look as bad as it had last night. Maybe because she remembered how Ethan had shown up without hesitation. In the middle of the storm to help her, she smiled faintly. He had said he'd come by in the morning, but she hadn't expected him to actually show up this early. Yet right on cue, she heard footsteps. When she looked up, Ethan was already walking through the gate with his usual easy stride, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a brown bag. "Morning," he called out, smiling. "I brought breakfast. You look like someone who didn't sleep much." Claire laughed softly. "You'd be right. Storms make me restless." He handed her a cup. "Then you need caffeine, and maybe a blueberry muffin." She took it with a grateful smile. "You're officially spoiling me, Ethan Walker." He shrugged, grinning. "Just being a good neighbor." They sat on the porch steps, sipping their coffee while the morning sun dried the wet yard. The air was peaceful now, quiet except for the chirping of birds. For a few minutes, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt natural, like two people who didn't need to fill every second with words. When Claire finally looked at him, she noticed how different he looked in the daylight, relaxed, but thoughtful, like someone who carried both strength and softness. She wanted to thank him again for last night, but didn't know how to put it into words that didn't sound too emotional. "You know," she said, "you didn't have to come out in this storm like that." Ethan looked at her, serious now. "I couldn't just sit there and watch from my window. You needed help." "But you barely know me," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes you don't need years to know when something or someone matters." His words caught her off guard. She didn't reply right away, just looked at the fence, pretending to study the damage. The truth was, she had felt the same thing, but had been too afraid to name it. Life had made her cautious, careful not to hope for too much. But with Ethan, that caution felt weaker every day. After breakfast, they got to work. The ground was still muddy, but the sun was already drying it out. Ethan replaced the cracked boards while Claire held them steady. They worked faster this time, laughing at small mistakes, teasing each other about who was the better carpenter. The lightness between them made everything easier. At one point, Claire stood back to admire the almost finished repair. "You know," she said, "this fence might have been the best accident that ever happened." Ethan looked at her and smiled. "Yeah, even with the tree damage." "Especially because of it," she replied, half joking but meaning every word. There was a long pause. Then Ethan set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans. His tone shifted, softer now, more personal. "Claire, can I tell you something?" She looked at him curiously. "Of course." He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When I moved here, I didn't expect much. I just wanted a quiet place, somewhere to rebuild, you know? I wasn't looking to meet anyone. But then I met you. And somehow this old fence turned into something that matters more than I thought it could." Claire felt her chest tighten. The sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, it was more than she'd prepared for. She set down the paintbrush in her hand, unsure what to do with the sudden rush of emotion. "Ethan," she began softly, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, a small nervous smile playing on his lips. "I just wanted you to know. That's all." She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint lines near his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the quiet honesty in his expression. "You've been kind to me more than you should have," she said. "But you should know something too. I wasn't ready for this, for feeling anything again." Ethan nodded. "I get that. Trust me, I do." There was another moment of silence, gentle, full of understanding. Then Claire reached out, her hand brushing his arm lightly. "But I'm glad you showed up that day," she said with a small, genuine smile. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone to remind me that not everything good has to end." His smile returned, that quiet, easy smile that always made her chest feel lighter. "Then I'll keep showing up," he said softly. "Not just for fences, Claire. For you." Her heart caught at his words. There was no dramatic declaration, no rush of romance, just truth, simple and steady, the kind that didn't fade. They stood there side by side, watching the repaired fence gleam under the sun. It wasn't perfect. A few boards were slightly uneven, and the paint still needed another coat, but it stood strong. And somehow it felt like more than just wood and nails. It was a symbol of how far they'd both come. Ethan turned toward her. "You know, we've rebuilt this thing twice now," he said with a laugh. "At this rate, we could start a business." Claire laughed too. "Walker and Dawson Repairs. Has a nice ring to it," smiled. "Maybe it does." As the wind rustled through the trees, Claire glanced up at the sky. Soft blue with streaks of white clouds. The world felt still, full of quiet possibility. She realized then that this wasn't about rushing into something new. It was about allowing herself to feel again, to trust that life could bring good things even after loss. When Ethan finally left that afternoon, he didn't say goodbye the way neighbors usually did. Instead, he said, "See you later," with a kind of certainty that felt like a promise. And as she watched him walk back to his yard, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the empty kind that comes from avoiding pain, but the calm that comes from letting someone in. That night, as the sun set behind the hills and the light faded from her backyard, Claire stood at the window with her tea. The fence looked beautiful now, standing between their houses, not as a divider, but as a bridge. It held the memory of hard work, laughter, shared effort, and quiet understanding. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Thank you, Ethan." Across the yard, Ethan stepped out onto his porch, looking toward her house as if he'd heard her. Their eyes met for just a moment, a silent exchange that said everything neither needed to speak aloud. Two hearts, once broken in different ways, had found each other through something as simple as a fence. And though neither knew what the future would hold, one thing was certain: the wall that had once stood between them had turned into the very thing that brought them together. And sometimes that's how love begins. Not with grand gestures or perfect timing, but with small acts of kindness, a helping hand, and the courage to rebuild, piece by piece.